Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlin
And Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Chaos.
And most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link Season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
Welcome,
everybody.
welcome to the Mything Link.
To the Mything Link.
Mything Link.
Welcome.
Welcome. So today we're talking about
Poseidon, the god of the sea, the earth shaker, the earthquake maker.
makes me want to say Beluga Saruga come winds of the Caspian Sea. So again, since we're in season 1, still talking about Greek mythology, there is a content warning associated with this episode. Content warning: rape, maritime law, unpredictability of the sea, abduction, murder, affairs, human destruction, divine punishment. There's our content warning. And today, as we look at Poseidon, we're going to talk a little bit about his influence on the Greek world and also how that influence carries over to today with our friend and colleague, Professor Kristin Jøsvoll, Professor of Museum and Maritime Studies at Texas A&M Maritime University. So we are very excited to explore the sea today. In Chaos, Poseidon is portrayed by Cliff Curtis, who is an actor of Maori descent from New Zealand. So one thing we do mention is the specific choice of Chaos to cast a Polynesian actor in the role of Poseidon and the similarities between Poseidon as the god of the sea in Greek mythology and other gods like Maui and the Polynesian pantheon. But I would say that Maui and Poseidon are not one for one. I would say Maui is kind of a combination of like Hermes and Dionysus and Poseidon, maybe a little Prometheus in there too, because Maui famously stole fire from the gods and brought it to humanity. So I love Maui.
I know, Maui's so fun.
And so the choice of Chaos to cast a Polynesian actor as Poseidon, I thought really was a lovely blend and a call to this mythology of the sea and the Polynesians as arguably, I'd say, the best navigators, historically speaking, of any culture that we know about today.
Absolutely.
So Poseidon is the younger brother of Hades and the older brother of Zeus. If you listen back to our episodes on Prometheus and Zeus, we talk about this a little bit more. Of the Titan Kronos famously received a prophecy that one of his children was going to get stronger than him and overthrow him. So every time his wife gave birth, he would snatch the child and gobble him down. So Hades was born first, and most of our accounts say that Poseidon was born next. There are some sources that say that Poseidon was gobbled down just like the rest of his brothers and sisters until Zeus came about. But there are some sources that say that Poseidon was raised in a similar manner to Zeus, where he was saved by his mother, not gobbled up by his father, and instead sent to the island of Rhodes and was raised by the Telcanes, who had flippers for hands.
Cute. Like little baby seals.
And so while Zeus was raised in the caves on the island of Crete by the nymphs, Poseidon was raised in a more seafaring culture. So traditionally, most sources say that the Holy Trinity of the Greek gods, Zeus on Mount Olympus, Poseidon in the sea, and Hades in the underworld, they got their respective assignments by drawing lots. But then we see that Poseidon has this association with the ocean already as he's growing up before the Olympians even come into power. So like most things about mythology, it's sticky and squishy and shrouded in mystery, but here we are with lots of different stories about his birth. So I think that that's fun. Poseidon is the father of over 100 children and monsters.
Fuck, dude.
Yeah, he be busy. And some of those famous children include Orion. He also, we talk about this in season 1, episode 7, on our episode on Medusa. When Medusa was raped by Poseidon and then murdered by Perseus, after Perseus beheaded her, she birthed 2 children. And so the famous child is Pegasus. And so Pegasus is typically considered a child of Poseidon as well. And also, of course, Trident, who is frequently depicted with the trident and as a merman, similar to what we see in The Little Mermaid.
Did you say he was the father of Theseus?
I did not.
Because he was the father of Theseus. And I wrote in my notes, like father, like son, question mark. And then, well, Poseidon was a rapist. Theseus was just a fuckboy.
The fuckboy to rapist pipeline, though, is
it's
pretty efficient route.
Yeah.
We laugh so we don't die. He is, like Caitlin said, the earth shaker, the god of the sea, of lakes, and of streams. So he's the god of both saltwater and freshwater. And he is also the god of horses. So sometimes he's portrayed as a horse. Sometimes he is portrayed with horses pulling his chariot. Sometimes he is venerated or honored by sacrifices of horses being thrown into the sea. And then, of course, we do have the ancient Greek mythological creature called a hippocampus. And while we today tend to think of it as like a specific region of the brain, our region of the brain was named that because the scientists thought that it was shaped like the ancient Greek creature, which is technically a seahorse, but a seahorse as like a mermaid centaur with a horse upper half and like a mermaid tail. And so Poseidon is frequently depicted with those.
So part of Poseidon's association with horses isn't just because he has children that resemble horses like Pegasus. It's because there's a story that when Demeter was roaming the earth searching for Persephone, Poseidon saw her and tried to rape her. So she turned into she turned into a mare to get away from him. And his solution to catch up back with her is to turn into a stallion and rape her in horse form. So the product of this unfortunate union was the first divine horse. How the first horse was created that he gave to humans was he fell asleep on the ground and had a wet dream that fertilized the earth. And from this, the first horse emerged.
No. I hate it so much.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot I like about this dude.
One thing I do like about Poseidon is that when Hera decided she was sick of Zeus's shit and tried to overthrow Zeus's power on Mount Olympus, Poseidon sided with Hera. And we see that reflected in Chaos, that they have a bit of an alliance and some plans that are being intentionally withheld from Zeus. So I really did like the way that Chaos incorporated that tension and
Poseidon's independent streak.
And I really like how Chaos portrayed him as being this, the way that I saw it, like we've talked about in the Zeus and Hera episodes as well, like the palaces on Mount Olympus and Chaos are shown as being outdated, as kind of like belonging to the glamour of a world that no longer exists, and having these markers of value and social currency that no longer hold the weight that they used to. It feels the same for Poseidon. Like he has all these markings and trappings of wealth, but he's on a ship on a big yacht with all the little details embroidered and stitched on everything, and he's by himself. And he's still not happy. He can't have the woman who he loves, his sister Hera, who's married to his brother.
God.
He can't have the power he desires because the lots were chosen of whose domain was whose. In these stories we have that compare his childhood to Zeus's. He didn't come out of that with the power, and in fact I don't really see him in the stories of the Titanocemy having a big role in the same way that Zeus does. So we see, for all intents and purposes, right, like he's the frustrated older brother whose little brother gets all the glory and all the power. And I think Chaos really explores those themes of their relationship. So we see that Poseidon in Chaos is having like a sexual affair with Hera, along with their plotting and scheming. Did you find anything in your research to suggest that that has any grounds in mythology, that Hera and Poseidon had any sort of dalliances or sexual relationship or children born out of that or anything like that?
I did not. Honestly, the only things I found regarding Poseidon's sexuality was that he had a wife who was a sea nymph, and he went around raping every beautiful girl that walked on the seashore.
Yes, it seems like Amphitrite,
Amphitrite, one of those two. Fuck if I know, dude.
It seems like she, again, there's more parallels between the stories of Zeus and Poseidon in the women that they are paired with. And she is depicted very much as a Hera type character who goes on jealous rampages and punishes the victims of Poseidon's sexual assaults. And one example that stood out to me was Amphitrite cursed a nymph named, a mortal, I believe, named Scylla, to have 6 dog heads spring out of her body. And so then eventually, when the dog heads kept like slobbering and snapping at him, Poseidon lost interest in her. And she was happy to have her husband home again. Come on. Gross. This is just so gross.
So gross.
Ugh. And we have the story of Poseidon's wife as essentially like being an unwilling bride, where she was performing a dance with her sisters, and Poseidon saw her and tried to ask for her hand, and she refused him and fled to Atlas, and Poseidon sent a dolphin after her to bring her back. And afterwards, after Poseidon married her, he rewarded the dolphin by putting a constellation in the sky.
Huh, I didn't know that. I feel like he's a dude that fetishizes virginity.
Interesting. Can you speak more on that? I know he famously took Medusa's virginity by force.
Yeah, a story from the Metamorphoses that came to mind while you were saying that, that's not necessarily, I mean, you didn't say that she was a virgin or anything like that, but it was what I thought of. There's the story of the crow, how the crow came to be in Ovid's Metamorphoses. I think it's in book 2. It's the same basic pattern of every fucking Poseidon story that we've ever talked about, which is this girl who's beautiful and the fairest of them all is walking down a seashore and attracts Poseidon's attention, and he lusts after her, and she rejects his advances and runs away. And as she's running away, she's holding up her hands, crying out to the gods, to mortals, to anybody to help her. She's like screaming bloody murder as he's trying to rape her. Nobody hears her except for Athena, who, as a virgin, takes pity on the other virgin, and as she's running with her hands raised, crying out to the gods or anybody to save her, Athena turns her into a crow so that she can fly away from Poseidon's advances and, metamorphose into something different that can't be raped by a gross-ass god who can't keep it in his pants. So I feel like, you have the story of Medusa, you have the story of the crow, you have the story of Caeneus and Canis. It just feels like, and maybe 3 doesn't quite make a pattern, but 3 victims is enough to tell that a serial killer is a serial killer. That's what defines serial. So I don't know. He's definitely a serial rapist if he's nothing else, but I do think he has a penchant for virgins.
A penchant?
A penchant. But you know what? He also, the story I just told, he also just tried to rape Demeter. It was, unless she's fucking Mary Mother of God, not a virgin because she had Persephone.
She's not a virgin. Demeter specifically propositioned Zeus so she could conceive a child. And it was like a one-time thing. So it could be possible that Poseidon took advantage of her before that.
Sure, that's
Unclear.
True. Unclear. Also, virginity definitely had, in such a context, virginity technically meant a woman who hadn't born a child yet. It wasn't necessarily related to sex for the first time or the breaking of the hymen.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So Poseidon was worshipped widely throughout Greco-Roman society, even though Athens, which was a maritime city, had a pretty rocky relationship with him, to say the least, to a point where the Athenians are going to pick their patron deity, and it's down to Poseidon and Athena, and how they're going to determine who they select is that each divinity is going to gift the people with some sort of treasure, and that's going to be the determining factor. So Poseidon gives the people of Athens a saltwater spring, whereas Athena gives the people of Athens the first olive tree. And so they select Athena as their patron deity. And Poseidon is enraged. He's humiliated. He's furious. And he takes revenge in the form of flooding Athens, flooding the countryside, destroying homes, destroying crops, to a point where Zeus intervenes to try and alleviate the situation. Eventually, the Athenians agree to build a temple to both Poseidon and Athena, even though Athens, obviously she remains the patron deity of the city. But I think it points to the fact that the reason Poseidon is associated with things like earthquakes and sea storms and not just the sea is because he was seen as incredibly tempestuous and unruly. He could not be controlled. He was super unpredictable. And I think it points to the unpredictable power of the sea, the unpredictable power of nature, the fact that nature can't be controlled by humans. It's a force to be reckoned with, and humans have always, out of necessity, had a relationship with water, but it's not always a positive one. Water has a dual nature. It's two-sided, it's twofold. It is both life-giving and also can take life away on a number of different levels, right? You're not going to try and drink seawater because that will kill you.
But the sea is giving food, giving trade routes, like
exactly. Water can be the
fickle
source.
Mistress.
Indeed, a fickle mistress. That cheeky minx.
This is one of the concepts I teach in my Intro to Mythology courses, is the deities tell us a lot about the geographical environment or the topography of a place where these deities are worshipped. So I give the classic example of looking at ancient Egyptian mythology versus ancient Mesopotamian mythology. And in ancient Egypt, the gods are largely considered to be fair. There's a sense of balance and order. There's a cyclical nature to the stories and to their sense of time. And when we look at ancient Mesopotamia, the gods are unpredictable and violent. And from where I'm standing, the mythology of both of these regions, it suggests to us, and we know, right, the Nile River is where Egyptian culture sprang up around and famously gave life, but it flooded in a consistent and predictable cyclical pattern. And in contrast, we have Mesopotamia, Meso between, and Potamus, water,
the fertile crescent,
the Fertile Crescent, right between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And these rivers very famously flood unpredictably and violently. They're not on the same kind of cyclical pattern. And so it makes sense that their gods would reflect that. And that's what we're seeing here with Poseidon, is he's seen as fickle, as hard to please, as tempestuous, as someone who perpetuates assault, right? The sea is a violent piece of nature and of our world, and something that's completely out of control. So it definitely makes sense that a god associated with that sea is going to have those attributes of forcefully and violently abducting people or killing people. Or he's famously portrayed with a lot of dolphins, and dolphins are known to be one of the only other animals on Earth that rapes for fun like humans do. And so that's one of my favorite things about mythology, is the truths that come to us through these stories. And the truth is that Poseidon is the sea personified. And the sea is violent and unpredictable. And of course, how could Poseidon be any different?
Of course. I love that example. It made me think of how, in ancient Egypt, the Nile flooded predictably enough that they were able to harness the power of the river to use for crop production, to fertilize their soil. They depended on the flooding of the Nile. They depended on that force of nature, that predictable force of nature to live. And the Athenians do the same thing, but it's not the same situation at all. There's no harnessing Poseidon. There's no stopping him from taking what he wants. He's madness. He absolutely is this violent, unhinged side of the sea. Something that came up for me while I was doing this research was Poseidon on the same side of that coin of being able to stir up these violent sea storms. He was also able to calm and soothe the waves. Whether or not he chose to, well, who the fuck knows. But what I immediately thought of upon reading about him causing this flood to Athens and, Zeus needing to step in because of all the destruction that he's causing with the waves and the winds is the story of, this is not going to surprise anybody, the story of Jesus calming the storm. And I know I talk about this all the time, how a lot of the Bible, particularly the New Testament, was written so to present a new paradigm for these, what they saw as archaic gods, who they were trying to usurp them with Jesus. Jesus is calming the storm for the sailors versus the unpredictability and unreliability of Poseidon taking sailors away and killing people. You have this new deity who sleeps through a fucking storm and then calms the waves and tells people to trust him, right? It's a new presentation of the divine. It's a way of saying that, Jesus is superior to these old gods because not only can he control the wind and the waves, but he will do it for humans. Whereas Poseidon, for you.
Yeah, the caretaking aspect instead of the fear-based tempestuous. Absolutely. I think that's a really strong point. I want to make sure we don't gloss over the fact that this flood that you're referring to could be seen as a parallel or an ancestor of the great flood myth that we see in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament, that we also see in the Epic of Gilgamesh with Utnapishtim as the Noah character. And there are a few different camps on this as far as mythological studies go, right? Do we see flood myths around the world because there was one kind of proto flood myth that all these other myths are descended from, that as people spread out, if we're going with the out of Africa theory, there's a core group of humanity mothered by our mitochondrial Eve, and they shared one group of myths, and as people grew and spread throughout the rest of the world, they took these stories with them and the stories morphed and changed? Or does every human society have to live near water to survive, and because of this, every human society is going to have stories about the power of that water to take life away, right? And that's where we get these flood stories, because if you're in a society that you don't have access to planes, trains, or automobiles, if there's a local flood from your local water source, your whole world has flooded. That's a worldwide flood. And that's a reasonable read that your world has flooded. So, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious with the way I told the story which camp that I'm in, but you never know. It could be a little bit of both. And I think that's a lot of what mythology is. It's always a little bit of both. And people have these different experiences over and over again. And
I tend to be in the both boat.
you like Heracles, 1 foot on each side.
1 foot on each side. I mean, that's not shocking either. I tend to toe the gray line on fucking everything. That's something when I teach Genesis, I explain what you just explained about if your world is 1 or 2 villages big and you have a flood that wipes out your fucking town and it's saved by one man with a boat, that's your whole world flooding. That is your Noah's Ark situation.
Right. And that is a truth and a true story, and a metaphorical truth about somebody's entire world flooding doesn't need to be taken literally as the entire earth was covered in water.
That's the other thing I say. just because it wasn't historically accurate doesn't mean it's not true. Just because they didn't have the same understanding of the whole world that we have now in the 21st century doesn't mean their whole world didn't flood. I also think it points to even the Old Testament God was this violent God who flooded the whole earth and committed genocide according to this story, right? He wasn't a whole lot different than Poseidon from that front. But again, you have Jesus coming in and presenting a new story. I do believe in mitochondrial Eve and the spread of all the mythology. However, I am a Near Eastern scholar and tend to think, the story of Noah's Ark and the one in the Epic of Gilgamesh are too fucking similar for me to not believe that the biblical one is a reinterpretation of the older myth from the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Sure. I'd say there's definitely a difference in approach of all mythology springs from the same source, and these stories from this same part of the world at a similar time were based on the same myth. I mean, I think that, yeah, absolutely.
I think that's pretty safe way to toe that line.
I think that's pretty safe. Yeah.
Also, it makes sense to me. Like when you think about the flood that they're referencing in the Epic of Gilgamesh, so much fucking older than the historical record.
It's so much older, and these are oral cultures who are passing their stories generation to generation in storytelling format, and someone says, hey, I've got a new spin on this old story, or I've got a new understanding of it, or culture has changed in such a way that we're retelling the story in a new way. And I don't think that takes away from the power and the beauty of it.
I think it does the opposite. I completely agree.
100%.
Ooh, got chills from that.
Ooh.
Even when I was a practicing Christian, I wasn't offended by the idea that Genesis or the Old Testament was a mythology in itself that was conflated or representative of or the same thing as or taken from different other mythologies, right? That is the process of storytelling. That is the beauty of the human experience. Just because I say this every time I teach on the Old Testament or I teach on ancient Mesopotamia, just because it wasn't a historical enlightenment flavored truth, as we would say, doesn't mean it wasn't true. My feelings are true, even though they're not a scientific fact, right? Just because, and that's the easiest way I can put that example.
And that's why I prefer to use the definition of mythology is a story a culture tells itself that it believes to be true, or it acts as if it is true. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not.
Right. Absolutely.
Right? I don't think there's inherent truth in the fact that women don't deserve autonomy over their body in the same way that men do. But our culture believes that story to be true in a way that impacts our laws, our access to medical care, our access to mental health services, our access to community support, all of those things. And because of people's belief in that story, people die. And so it doesn't matter if there's a real truth or not to it, because the impacts to humans is real.
It's so true.
So I'll get off my soapbox now. But
you don't have to. I love your soapbox. I also agree with your
About
soapbox.
that.
So something else that comes out when I teach on Christianity, there was a certain point in time, namely the Enlightenment, when we decided as Christians, as people, as the backbone of Western civilization, however you want to frame it, that scientific truth was the only one that mattered. And so the mythology became not a story anymore.
It literalized the mythology and said, if this isn't literally and objectively true.
Objectively true, right? That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I think the Enlightenment brought about this idea that there is objective, knowable truth that can be found out by humans about everything. And everything can be distilled down to these truths that we hold to be self-evident, right? That all men are created equal.
Right. And because it happened in a society that was the child of Greco-Roman philosophy, Christianity became that objective truth, that mythology of how humans took up space and the great chain of being, that became the objective truth. And so you have this mythology that is now conflated with science in a way that is violent to women's bodies and sex. And I have a lot of feelings about the Enlightenment. I don't necessarily think that science isn't true or important or real. What I think is that it had an impact on the mythology of Western religion that was really, I'm going to say, detrimental, because that's what I believe.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about our own culture and our own cultural ancestors, and we're coming from it with an insider's perspective. And this is how we feel about the culture that we were raised in. And I think it's appropriate to bring value judgments against our own cultural experience.
I completely agree.
I think it's important and necessary for society to move forward, for people to speak their truth. And there's more than one truth. And that's the whole idea that we're talking about. There's not just one objective truth. All things can be true at the same time. And especially when we're talking about like a relational perspective, like I think it's so important for us to remember as we are developing community support during this fraught political time in the United States and figuring out how to be in community with people and how to build empathy and how to be in relationship, whether it's communal, platonic, romantic, whatever it is. It's so important for us to remember that multiple things can be true at once, and these tensions can all exist in opposite. I know I've been in relationship with people where we both feel like we're doing more than our fair share of the work, and we probably are, because we're making different assumptions and we're living different truths. And it doesn't mean one person's necessarily wrong. Competing truths are a fair and normal part of life, and we have to make sure we're all speaking the same language. Again, another soapbox.
I love it. This has become this is no longer about Poseidon.
But that's what the gods do, right? That's what these stories do. They force us to confront these truths in ourselves and in our culture and in our relationships. And that's why it's so powerful.
That's the power of mythology.
I think it's very important. A couple things I want to make sure we bring up. Number one, I really loved the way that chaos integrated and showed Poseidon's role with King Minos. And that really echoes the mythology. And we, of course, talk about this more in our episode on the Minotaur, but I just want to make sure that we address it here with Poseidon, that while King Minos was a son of Zeus in the mythology, he was also a devotee of Poseidon, I guess we could say, as being on Crete, and Poseidon had a huge role in the creation of the Minotaur and that whole story. So if you'd like to learn more about that, you could listen to one of our back episodes on the Minotaur. That's going to be our season 1, episode 10 is on the Minotaur. So if you'd like to learn more about Poseidon, that's the place to do it, and his involvement in that story. I also want to talk a little bit about Atlantis. I think that is a story that holds a lot of the public imagination, and one that I think us here in the US, we don't really relate to Poseidon. I know I didn't relate Atlantis to Poseidon when I was growing up, and we've seen Atlantis portrayed in all sorts of movies and cartoons, very famously in, I think it's just called Atlantis, right?
Yeah, it is.
I really do feel that someday humankind is going to learn the true history of Atlantis, because I don't know.
Are you going to be the one that does it?
I'm not going to be the one that does it. But I think, like, historically, the city of Atlantis, I think, does have a kernel of truth and has historical roots to it in much the same way that the city of Troy does. I think it's a mythological account of a seafaring civilization. Absolutely. And I think that the stories of Atlantis are the stuff of legend. I don't know if this was necessarily like a more technologically advanced society or whatever ancient astronaut theorists would suggest.
It makes me think of the story in the Bible where Joshua walks around the walls of the city of Jericho and they all come crumbling down. Jericho was a real place, but archaeologically did not have walls the way that they're explained.
Because they came tumbling down.
I mean, bear with. It wasn't the way it was described in the Bible, despite the fact that it's a real place, right?
Right. And like,
still doesn't make it any less magical.
Bars and clubs are real places, and the stories that people tell about their experiences in them are not what we would consider objective truth.
Unless it's the Pink Pony Club.
I'm gonna keep on dancing. Okay. What do you think? Do you think the Pink Pony Club is affiliated with Poseidon?
I was just about to ask, maybe the Pink Pony Club is Atlantis.
maybe the Pink Pony Club is Atlantis. Maybe the Pink Pony Club is Atlantis without the influence of Poseidon, and that's why we have such positive femininity associated with it.
Fuck yeah.
Come at us, Chapel Roan. Let us know your thoughts.
Let us know your thoughts, Chapel Roan. Hang out with us, Chapel Roan.
Yes, we love you, please. But our classical mythology suggests that Poseidon was associated with Atlantis, that he either lived there or he created it, or some kind of combination of the two, specifically for his human lover, Cleito. And then he sank Atlantis with a smash of his trident, shaking the earth.
So creation and destruction are two sides of the same coin, right? And we see that 100% with Poseidon, you know, like I was saying before, the dual nature of water, it's both life-giving and life-stealing. And Poseidon is both life-giving and life-stealing. He both creates and he destroys. We see that over and over again throughout these mythologies about him. You know, with Atlantis, with in the Iliad, he, you know, according to the mythology, he built the walls of Troy and then sided with the Greeks to fight against Troy when he felt like he was gypped. So it's that idea that you can't have one without the other. That's not necessarily a bad thing, if you will. It more makes me think that, can you correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't recall any stories of Hades or Zeus creating anything.
I mean, they didn't create humanity in any of the Greek creation stories because the humans existed and then the flood happened and then the humans were created again. But that was the son of Prometheus, I believe, that did that. Yeah. I mean, they create a bunch of children.
Sure.
Arguably, they father a significant portion of the human race with all of their rapes and affairs. But no, I don't know, but I know that we're going to do research that probably proves us wrong because every time we do research, I'm like, well, I found another human that descended to the underworld and came back, and I claimed there were only 2 of them. I was reading about Psyche, and I was like, well, fuck me, there's another one.
It's fun to be wrong.
It is.
You know?
It is.
It just made me think, like, Poseidon is creative in a different way than the other Greek gods, but he's also incredibly destructive in a way that's different from the other Greek gods. And I think you could arguably say that in his own way, the stories of Poseidon are pourquoi tales for natural disasters.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he is the unpredictability of the sea personified.
Sure. So you have the sinking of Atlantis.
Yeah, and the stories tell us that Atlantis sank because Poseidon was angry that the Atlanteans were getting greedy and not honoring him in the right way, and he sank them with a combination of earthquakes and a fire, which are all natural disasters, which is really why I think that there are kernels of truth to the city of Atlantis. I'm surprised we don't have more stories about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and mythology that sprang from that. And who knows what kind of folklore was happening around that area.
I've never thought of that before. I mean, I just always think like Pompeii, but that's not really a mythology, right?
It's not a mythology. But here's the thing, like we had folks who witnessed it, like the famous account by Pliny the Younger, I believe, right? Not the Elder. I'm going to look that up before
one of the 2 of them.
I know it is, but I'm gonna check my sources before I say it. Yes, Pliny the Younger's letters to a Roman historian are the only surviving eyewitness accounts of the Mount Vesuvius eruption in 79 CE. And the fact that we have any eyewitness accounts to the eruption of Vesuvius is absolutely incredible. But think of what would happen if we never unearthed Pompeii or Herculaneum from an archaeological perspective. All we have are these letters, right? And I feel like it's a similar thing with Troy and Atlantis. Like there are natural disasters that folklore and mythology spring out of, trying to make sense and meaning of the world around us. And it helps us. We talked about this before. One of the functions of mythology and folklore is to help us believe that we have some sort of control over our environment, when oftentimes we don't. We are at the mercy of the elements. And even today in our modern culture, we're at the mercy of the elephant. Of the elephant. We're at the mercy of the elements, and we like to think that we're past that because our science can predict the weather and it can tell us when storms are coming or when a meteor is coming or whatever. So it could never happen here. But we're seeing with climate change that that's not true at all.
Meteorological prediction also. Like, just to be clear, they're never right. Like, right now my computer says 1 inch of snow, and it's like the fucking sunniest day that we've had in like a week or two outside.
Yeah.
I'm just here, man.
Hard to tell. But we put our faith into these, soothsayers. But it functions in the same way. We want to feel like we have some element of control or predictability. And the reality is that we don't. Because if money and wealth could buy predictability and safety from the elements, then the Palisades fire would have never happened.
I have this theory that's, I think,
tell me more.
Not my own theory. I think other people have said
Standing
this
on the
theory.
shoulders of giants, yes.
Yes. Or maybe it's just like a conglomeration of things other people have said.
Yes.
But I firmly believe that Elon Musk is actively trying to destroy this world so that we're forced to move into outer space.
Hot take. Hot take. Because he's actually an alien and he's been sent to this planet to destroy us.
I have one more thing to say that I forgot.
Hell yeah.
Which is Poseidon is arguably the main antagonist in the Odyssey. Going back to what I was talking about last week with Odysseus taking 10 fucking years to get
took the long way home.
The long way home. Part of that was because Odysseus and his crew land on this island where a child of Poseidon, a cyclops named Polyphemus, lives. And Odysseus blinds Polyphemus, and Polyphemus cries out to Poseidon, his father, for him to take vengeance for him. So part of why Odysseus doesn't make it home in a timely fashion is because he faces a plethora of storms and violent waves and violent winds that drive him off course over and over and over again. And that is because Poseidon is pissed that Odysseus blinded his son.
I know we've kind of talked shit on Odysseus in the past, like, yo, bro, how'd you get lost for 10 years? And the truth is that, yes, Poseidon was intentionally fucking with him in order to keep him off track. And we haven't really done like an etymology corner really this episode. So I would love to say that Polyphemus, etymologically speaking, we know poly means many and phemus means fame. And so it means like someone, like a celebrity, someone who's spoken of a lot, like many stories told of this person, many things said about this person.
I don't know what many things are said about him.
Well, I mean, if his blindness caused a 10-year adventure, he was probably spoken about a fair amount.
That's fair enough. Odysseus also, he comes head to head with Charybdis and the Scylla. And Charybdis is a child of Poseidon. So when Odysseus is trying to get through these two cliffs, if you got around Charybdis, which was a whirlpool that was seen to have teeth like the sandworm in Star Wars, the Scylla was said to be on the cliffs. So if you got around the whirlpool and were still managing to make it through that chasm, you would still have to deal with the Scylla who was guarding it above. She was like snatching bitches off the deck of the boat and stuff. She's a man-eating monster, and I fucking love it.
Today, we are super excited to have Professor Kristin Jøsvoll from Texas A&M in Galveston. Caitlin and Kristen, two of my best friends from different areas of my life. It's so exciting to be here all together at the same time. Super stoked on it. Heck yeah, same.
Heck yeah.
Heck yeah. Kristen, would you like to say a little bit about your academic background, your research, the types of classes you teach?
So I predominantly teach within the museum studies program that we have. That's also what my master's is in, but I also dabble in a lot of folklore, and I teach a historic seafaring class. I teach maritime folklore and intro to maritime studies within our Department of Maritime Studies. I know a little bit about the mythos of Poseidon and specifically how he impacted the daily lives of the maritime community and seafarers and all their superstitions, their rituals, how they behaved, all of that jazz.
Love
Yes.
it.
Yes.
Love it. And just as like an extra context, fun note, 13 years ago, Kristin and I met on an island in the Baltic working on an archaeology dig. We got put on the same pit team together as undergrads, and we were working on a Viking era farmstead. I was very, very lucky to have swooped her up from there. We're still great friends to this day. So Kristin has a lot of both practical and classroom experience and knowledge about the maritime community in all different aspects.
Yeah.
Super stoked to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm just going to start us off by saying, fuck Poseidon. I hate him. Hate everything
For
about him.
real?
I don't hate everything about him. I hate that he's a rapist. And that makes it hard for me to think anything positively about him.
Fuck Poseidon.
So fuck Poseidon. He's the worst.
Fuck Poseidon.
I hate him less than I hate Zeus, but like
Me too.
it's only because I don't know as many of his stories, I think. To be fair. He seems cut from the same. He seems cut from the same cloth as Zeus, is what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, they are broskies.
I think we should maybe start with the wider perspective, pulled out a little bit about just maritime folklore and just the environment around that. So I know from being outside of the maritime community that the maritime community is very superstitious with a lot of their beliefs. And this community specifically worldwide has held on to more of these superstitions than perhaps their counterpart groups on land have in these cultures.
Absolutely. In my maritime folklore class, we talk about Bascom's functions of folklore, but then there's an additional one within maritime community. And so it's always, functions to entertain, to educate, to validate within your folk group, and to, conformity within the folk group, and ostracize those that don't conform. But then within the maritime community, and I think this also applies to other folk groups globally, is having this necessity of a sense of control. Because within the maritime realm, historically speaking, as far back as we know that the ship of any size was created, being a sailor basically was a death sentence. They have the highest or second highest mortality rate, historically speaking, from the 13th century onward, which I think is second to lumberjacks, right? If you're throwing chainsaws in the air, that's probably...
I'm sorry, is that the job of lumberjacks? Their primary objective? Juggling chainsaws?
And then they end up in, sideshows. They get talked about in museum studies. But, right, so like if you're talking about these maritime communities, right, life at sea, regardless of where you're located. Well, in my class, we focus on the age of sail. So things from around the late 15th century all the way up to the present day, but we mostly end like at the 19th century. But it's not to say that these superstitions and rituals don't pervade to today, because they absolutely do. But you had a lot of things happening within Europe, right, where you have the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, the Ottoman Empire.
How long did the 100 Years' War last for?
let me see. Right. So, and then you have like the Great Famine. All of these things are happening within the 1300s. And in Western civilization at that time, no resources, a third of your population is gone, lack of food, you're cut off with your trade east because the Ottoman Empire is like, you're not coming through this way. And so you have the Mediterranean, so you can deal with North Africa, or you can go and explore the big blue wet thing, right? But with that, so life at sea was full of all of these hardships where you had poor diet, poor hygiene, there's cramped living spaces, little to no money, no freedom. You're literally trapped in something at best the size of a football field with maybe 300 other men, or on like a merchant vessel, which could be, sizes are not my forte. But like, very cramped living spaces, and you're dealing with the same people for potentially months to years at one time. And then you have disease, you have all kinds of death from whether it's
Scurvy.
war, accident, disease, right? Any sort of weather that pops up. You had punishment if you were in the Royal Navy, like flogging around the fleet was a thing. So they needed this sense of control. And then a lot of this came within their spirituality.
I want to take a little TO there because you brought up something super, super important that I want to make sure we explain for folks. One of the functions of mythology and folklore is to provide this like framework through which to view and understand the world, and also to feel those elements of control. It's a lot harder to approach a storm in the sea from a ship when you feel like there's nothing but chaos and you're completely at the mercy of the ocean, right? But if you feel like there's a ritual that you can do, a prayer that you can make, an offering that you can offer, something like that, it gives you this illusion. It feels like you have some sort of control over the outcome of things that are uncontrollable and unknowable. And gosh, if the sea isn't tempestuous and scary and spooky and
right?
Gosh, I mean, I know you and I have both been out on a boat at in the middle of the night and there's nothing. I mean, it really does feel like being on the edge of the world, staring into the void. And
and that's another thing. So like mental health is a component of life at sea, right? And so when we're dealing with all of these functions of folklore, I'm not surprised at all when you have these deities that, even if they're not practicing that religion, an element of that deity or the appropriation of that deity to fit within the current mythos that they believe in allows those rituals and those traditions to continue on. And needing to have some sort of control in a place where there's absolutely no control, because you're also having to think of the social hierarchy of a vessel. Okay, who has absolute authoritarian power? The captain does, right? And then any sort of officer therein that falls underneath him. Now, if it's a merchant vessel, again, it's just only going to be the captain. So if you do something you're not supposed to, they could call you a Jonah and throw you overboard. They don't have any paperwork to do. So you want to ensure that you're doing everything that you're supposed to, that things are shipshape, because you're entrusting your life and all of your shipmates are trusting you with their lives in order to have a seaworthy venture and fair winds and all that jazz.
So how does Poseidon
fit into all of this?
Yeah, like what's his deal?
So if we're looking from Greek mythology, right, which is where he's a prominent figure, we also have, and I mentioned this to you earlier when we were chatting, is there are a few other iterations of, I guess, what Poseidon was appropriated to be, or elements from other cultures, but it's all in the same kind of area. Was Enoch and Ah, which is the Sumerian or Mesopotamian god of water, both salt and fresh, wisdom, knowledge, magic, creation. And the one thing that we know about water within lore is that it is everything. It is the creation of life, it is the sustainment of life, and it's also the destruction of life. And so, yeah, I know. Within the Mediterranean, in and of itself, like even if we're not getting into the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, a lot of this is based on life and destruction. And with these sailors coming through, I find it so fascinating, specifically when we're talking about Poseidon, because he's late Bronze Age. In terms of like temples and offerings and rituals for Poseidon, I know that he was extremely influential within the merchant mariners because of trade. I know that they would do this if there were any sort of like conflicts of war, but it was very much significant within the Mediterranean maritime trade community, and they would provide lots of offerings, right? So this is where we get, when you christen a ship, which is also within Christianity, like a sort of a baptism that happens and rites of passages. Ships were personified within the maritime community, and predominantly they were always female, like named female, because you would have your mistress of the sea, you would have your wife or girlfriend back home, but she was your protector, she was your home when you were out at sea for months to years on end. But there were all of these rites of passage that a ship would go through, from the beginning of just even figuring out what piece of wood was going to be the backbone or keel of your vessel. And then when you laid it, you had to put it in a north to south fashion, because you had to have the magnetic poles of your wood align so that you didn't upset Charybdis, who is one of Poseidon's offspring, right? The whirlpool. And so a lot of these things still happen today that I know that they do when they're building new vessels. So you would have like a christening of a ship, right? The naming ceremony. You would also put this name in something called the Ledger of the Deep, which is essentially a logbook that Poseidon or Neptune or whomever at the time for that culture would have, that they knew what vessels were going to be in their waters and in their control during what time. And if you tried to rename your ship without doing another ceremony that included the gods, a lot of those ships sank, and they alluded that to, you didn't include them. You're trying to get around the gods and you're trying to piss people off, or gods piss gods off, right? And so you didn't want to do that, because not only was he the god of not just water, but horses, what else? Earthquakes,
storms sometimes, but like thunder and lightning is specifically Zeus's domain, but like the
like a hurricane,
the storms
or
of the
something.
sea, are typically associated with Poseidon.
And, historically speaking, the Mediterranean is full of that, whether you can take them from historical documentation or something like the Iliad or the Odyssey with Odysseus, right? So we know that Poseidon was very much still a part of ensuring that they don't make him angry or that they make him happy, right? It's not just that he's not upset, but that he's also glad that you're there.
Yeah, basically like sailors are visiting his domain, right? So
Exactly.
They have to make sure he's stoked to have them be there.
Exactly.
And I know part of his association with horses is not just his chariot pulled by seahorses, but that Greeks would throw horses into the water as offerings for Poseidon.
So one of the things that I specifically talk about in my folklore class, where we talk about the personification of vessels, and also the fact that the sailing community had this necessity within their lore to have this sense of control over absolutely nothing in their life.
Like lots of humans do, right?
Death literally everywhere. So one of the ways that they would protect themselves for an afterlife, which this is the part that I see really fascinating, right? Is when I'm talking about this, it's mostly Western European cultures that still continue this practice. And even today within the United States, it still happens with tall ships. A lot of these tall ships are either historic vessels that have been brought back to life, if you will. It's a historic vessel in and of itself. It's not a reproduction.
An authentic historic vessel.
Exactly. And so like we have one here in Galveston, which is called the Alyssa, and it's from 1877. She's a bark from Scotland, also then went to Greece. So that's part of her story. She smuggled cigarettes for a while and then came over to the United States. They salvaged her and basically made her a museum ship, so much like the Star of India, HMS Surprise, those sorts of things that happen to be at the San Diego Maritime Museum.
What does HMS stand for?
Is it not His Majesty's or Her Majesty's ship?
Huge motherfucking ship. That's what I think.
Sure. Because HMAS is His or Her Majesty's Australian ship. Like, so for all of the ships within the United States, if they're under our flag, then they're USS, a United States ship. So there's this practice that started back with the Greeks and the Romans, is the ship took on a life of its own. She had personalities. She was always gendered. And if you took care of her, she would take care of you. So within this process, they would actually, and I don't know how technical you want me to get into ship's terms, but do y'all know what masts are on sailing vessels? It's the big sticks that hold up all of the sails. Okay. But the way that they're stepped into the hull of the ship is they sit kind of, there's a keel, which is the backbone, and then a keelson, and then there's a mast up, and the mast goes all the way through all of the decking and sits on the base of the ship. And between the keelson and the mast with the mast step, they put coins. And this is for protection, for if the ship were ever to sink, she had the money to cross the river Styx, which this is one of the few inanimate objects that are given a soul and actually given, monetary compensation to be able to go to the afterlife. Because if not, she would end up in something, Davy Jones' locker, those sorts of things, which
Sure.
is super Christian and not so much Greek.
Sure. I'd love to hear more about the concept of the ship having a soul. Kind of from nuts to butts, right? From start to finish. There's a
nuts to butts.
So again, a lot of this has to do with
when it's born.
Yes. So these functions, no, honest. And so
the life cycle, yeah.
It's the life cycle. They have these rites of passage. So the ship, from actually finding the keel itself, that's the first thing you do. That's the backbone of the vessel. And they call it the backbone. And you have ribs. Like, it's very much human anatomy put onto this vessel, where she's given a name. There's a naming ceremony, all of this. But the keel has to be laid north to south, so that she had a true magnetic north, so that she couldn't get caught up in whirlpools, things like that, which I guess are pretty notorious within the Mediterranean, and then also within like the North Sea and things of that nature. And from there, they would have some sort of clergy come through and bless the vessel at different points to ensure that she, again, was religiously or spiritually taken care of. And then if in the building process that she would have pushback, or if she would be a little cranky with things, then the shipwrights would know that she would not necessarily be seaworthy, because she's going to be a typical woman and push back against the patriarchy. Right? And so there's all of these ceremonies, and then they get to the naming ceremony, which is very much like a baptism or even a confirmation, if you will. They have some sort of dignitary come through. That's where they do also some sort of a sacrifice. In some cultures, it's actually slaughtering an animal. Some it's just alcohol, or with the notorious one within the United States is what, a bottle of champagne over the bow or the whatever of the vessel. And then she goes into a specific ledger of the deep. And so Poseidon actually is the one, or Neptune has this ledger of the deep, and if you were to ever change her name, you have to have another formal ceremony to do so, because if you didn't, you're trying to do something to go behind his back, and you all know how well that goes with gods, right?
Oh, interesting. So it's like signing your name in the devil's book in the Salem witch trials, or perhaps registering your name in an international registry of other roller derby players, something like that.
And if she changed flags, so she went to a different country, the same thing would have to happen. You would have all new naming ceremonies, and there are certain rites of passage. So if you cross the equator, the sailors go through a certain ceremony, and so does the vessel, where now sailors are going from polywogs to shellbacks, and you can get a sea turtle tattoo. And if the further you go, you could get tribal tattoos on said sea turtle. I know they also have one for the international dateline in the present military, but because obviously that wasn't a thing hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
So there's like a specific branding available to those who have made that journey. So what kind of branding would we be eligible for that we've sailed to Antarctica?
Well, since we crossed the Drake, that's actually one of the scariest passages that exist in the known maritime world.
I know, we were just drinking and having a lovely time.
Dude, on this, 2 of my colleagues did research in Antarctica, and they had to go to Antarctica 3 separate times because of the Drake being so treacherous. That the first time they just couldn't do the pass, and then the second time they tried to go, some lady decided to take a shower when they told everybody, like, don't get up, don't move. So for those that are listening, the Drake is notorious for having terrible seas, the currents, the winds, everything. And I think that we had a pretty mellow, mild version of that. And I slept through the whole thing.
Yeah, we had like the mildest passage that like any of the crew had ever experienced.
And it was still like, it was rocking. And
I remember trying to walk outside on the deck while we were crossing it, and I was like, what? I like couldn't. Flip sliding away over there.
And I was asleep for a lot of the drink. But yeah, so some lady on their trip decided to shower and like knocked herself out in the shower, and so they had to return and go back to South America. And so then they eventually just flew into Antarctica for their third trek because they're like, we're not sailing anymore. So also dealing with this personification of vessels, this inanimate object having a soul, very much solidified to these sailors that if they take care of their home, then she will take care of them. And I think a lot of that had to do again with this sense of control of, you know, if we embody spirituality, if we embody this sense of, you know, this immortality upon the thing that keeps us literally from drowning, perhaps she will keep us safe. It's also why ships notoriously are called the mistress at sea, where, you know, the wives and things are not allowed necessarily on board unless you're an officer.
And let's clarify, unless you're an officer's wife, not unless you're a female officer, because that...
No, yeah, exactly. No.
Not...
Yeah, the only time that would happen that we have historically documented was a lot of pirates. So you had Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and again, that's going to be like European history because the Chinese had tons of women that were very important. So, and all of Polynesians with wayfinding, women were very much involved in that as much as the men were. So culturally, it's just totally different. But if we're talking from like the Mediterranean perspective and, you know, those European individuals, then that maritime community was very much like, women bad, we don't do that.
I would say Poseidon is patriarchal and misogynistic in his general attitude and behaviors. I don't think that's a hot take at all.
I like the thumbs up.
Yes. Can confirm.
But one thing I really did like about the show, to piggyback on what you're saying, Kristin, is that in the show Chaos, they portray Poseidon. He's played by a Polynesian actor.
Interesting.
Which I think is a really just fun nod to the seafaring culture. And of course, one of the stories of Poseidon and one of his powers in traditional Greek mythology is that with his trident, he could make the earth shake and he could make islands appear. Mm-hmm. And that's famously a power that Maui shares, and the creation of the Polynesian islands, especially the Hawaiian islands, and pulling them out. And he has his fishing hook, not his trident spear. But I love the parallels between the characters, and then we see that portrayed in Chaos,
and Moana.
That warmed my heart.
Moana.
Make way,
Moana, it's time you knew. Mata Nui is all you need.
Consider the coconut.
The island gives us what we need,
and no one leaves.
That's right, we stay.
We're safe and we're well provided.
That was the first Disney movie I ever watched that I actually connected with.
It's one of my favorite portrayals of the hero's journey, at the point where she sees her grandmother. Oh my God, I'm going to cry. Where she sees her grandmother and she realizes that the call isn't out there at all. It's inside me. It's like the tide, always flowing and rising. And I carry you here in my heart. You remind me. Oh, shit. All right. Woof.
Oh, man.
I love talking about Moana with the hero's journey, specifically for that moment where she feels like she can't follow the call and she gets reminded it's not external. It's inside. It's happening.
My initial reason for loving Moana is far more shallow. Because she's the first Disney princess that I ever looked like. Like, she had hips and was angry and didn't fit in with everybody else, no matter what they told her.
She's short and mad and does something about it.
Fuck yeah. Go get it, Moana.
So, Moana, great.
Mm-hmm.
Poseidon, bad.
Not great.
Kristin, do you know any other folklore or stories or traditions from around the world that are around or similar to Atlantis? Because there's some mythology that supports that Poseidon was associated with Atlantis, or perhaps he created the kingdom or lived there. And I'm curious, is that part of maritime folklore? Is that part of other cultures' stories that there's a magical... is it an archetype? Is it a trope?
So like yes and no. More so, a lot of the cultures will pull in like a certain kinds of cryptids and things of that nature, because then you can be like, well, they're everywhere. Whereas like one specific place like that, I mean, we first see it documented by Plato, right? And he's not even documenting as seeing it. It's this second or even a third hand account that
like
he
an urban
is writing.
legend?
Basically, that he is writing down, which happened potentially hundreds, if not thousands, years prior. But with that, they have people nowadays basically try to figure out where it is. I'm not talking about the History Channel, right? But to give this, we came from the sea, we are people of, this necessity being on the water, near the water, it's part of our lives. It's unavoidable. And so I talk about that specifically within the Maritime Studies department that I work in, is that all of the major cities around the world are based around some body of water. So like if you're talking about the United States, you have LA, you have New York, you have Houston, you have Chicago, you have Detroit, right? All of these are massive shipping hubs. And then you have places internationally, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Hong Kong, Sydney, London, etc. And so we have always had this necessity to be near the water, but specifically talking about Atlantis, it's not really something that permeates the way, like Plato's Atlantis does not permeate across those different cultures in the same way that people nowadays are like, well, it's in Africa or it's Thera.
And that would make sense if it was an island off of Crete.
Right. Well, and it has,
based on the stories,
right, those concentric rings like that are all inside each other, which, as we know, that Thera used to be a volcano and is exactly. And then now they think that it is parts of this one place in Africa, because the Saharan used to be underwater at some point. And so they're trying to understand a lot of that, where they have found topographic maps that could corroborate all of these things. And it's right next to, is that Gibraltar? Am I crazy?
The Strait of Gibraltar?
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. Don't look at me. I just know that that's a thing. I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
So the Strait 0% of geography.
So like we're Morocco and Spain, the Strait of Gibraltar, okay? And so they think that was the gates of Alexandria, where he had his feet planted on either side of the land, and then it was this massive shipping hub that would come through. And then there's parts within Algeria that they believe could be Atlantis. But again, that's very much attached to the Mediterranean. It's not like they think, the Bermuda Triangle is Atlantis, or, somewhere in the South Pacific is Atlantis. I'm sure someone on the History Channel thinks it's somewhere, but always, aliens. Right?
The History Channel.
It is the Strait of Gibraltar.
Yes.
Separating the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean.
I think it's like Alexander the Great.
I don't know anything about that guy.
I know that he was kind of gay.
What?
News? They were really close friends and roommates.
The Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules. That's what I'm referring to. So, a very long time ago, the Pillars of Hercules was at the Strait of Gibraltar, where the Atlantic and the Mediterranean met, right? And so, from what I remember, the Pillars of Hercules is he was supposed to have 1 foot on one side and 1 foot on the other. And this is basically like to either welcome you or to say you're not invited to all of what Alexander the Great had conquered.
Interesting. So Hercules' 10th labor was to fetch the cattle of Geryon and bring them to Eurystheus. I can't say these words.
Also, my new favorite thing is trying to read words that end in CLES, like Hercules. like obstacles and testicles and
I
and
love that.
People think you're crazy for all
Don't
of the
neglect
best
the
reasons.
testicles. Amazing. Amazing. Okay, so the mythology tells us, though, that Hercules, during his 10th labor, he used his superhuman strength to smash a mountain, and that's where the Strait of Gibraltar comes from, that connects the Atlantic and Mediterranean bodies of water.
Yeah. It's part of the mythos, right?
That
Like,
Heracles.
What a guy.
Another story tells us that instead of creating the Strait of Gibraltar, Hercules narrowed it, and so none of the sea monsters could get through. He made it too narrow for them to pass through.
So he trapped them in the Mediterranean?
So he
'Cause
trapped
that's where they
them.
all are.
How interesting. Okay. Are there any sea monsters associated that we should talk about?
I mean, there's Charybdis, right? Which is the whirlpool, and Scylla, which is the Hydra. And Charybdis, I think, is somewhere off of Greece. And it's this convergence of either currents or some super depth within the ocean that causes it. But then Charybdis is not just a whirlpool, but like this monster with teeth that actually consume. So, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't those Poseidon's kids? And again, that's whole part of like when you build your ship, you make sure that you have magnetic north so that you don't get trapped within Charybdis. And like the Christian seafarers did that. And you're like, really? You believe in this?
Charybdis is the daughter of Poseidon, but the Scylla isn't. She's the daughter of another different sea deity.
So the seafarers do rites and rituals to make sure that Poseidon protects their vessel from his children.
Yes, and that he doesn't smite them also in the process and deliver them to his kids.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of like paying off the mob.
A racketeering scheme, sure.
Yeah, right though. I mean, like, you're essentially paying the big boss so the goons he has control over don't get you, right? Like, isn't that kind of the definition of racketeering? Who knew? Poseidon's the head of a pyramid scheme.
He's the originator of a pyramid scheme. Or would that be the Egyptians?
I was going to say, I think that's Osiris. Well, let's talk a little bit. I know you want to talk about mermaids. Let's just do it. Let's just do some right now. Because I'm thinking about a fun fact for me is that Poseidon is the father of King Triton, historically, mythologically speaking. And then, of course, we have King Triton depicted as the father of Ariel, our famous Little Mermaid gal.
Disney's Little Mermaid.
Disney's Little Mermaid, specifically Disney's Little Mermaid. I don't think that King Triton shows up in the
Hans Christian Andersen. Well, her father, which she is unnamed, she's just the Little Mermaid in the Hans Christian Andersen version. Her grandmother plays a more significant role in her life than her father does. But there is some royal hierarchy, I believe. It's really not touched on because it's basically the Little Mermaid, the Hans Christian Andersen version of the Little Mermaid is so much dependent upon an individual who's not human, so therefore not mortal, and therefore cannot be immortal and reach the afterlife of, that's the whole point of the story, is for someone who is trying to attain the unattainable by chopping off her tongue and her legs, or her feet, and then their daggers and killing people.
And in the Hans Christian Andersen version, what happens to mermaids after they die is they don't have an immortal soul. They turn into the sea foam and just like kind of from whence they came. And
in the Hans Christian Andersen version of The Little Mermaid, I think they live to be 300 years. And then once they hit their 300th year, they turn into sea foam. I think that's why I find the lore of mer people so interesting, is that we come from water, evolutionarily speaking, right? We come out of the water, evolved into all of the creatures before us, yada, yada, yada. But also the fact that, when we're in the womb in amniotic fluid, we're floating around and breathing in liquid. So I find that absolutely fascinating that we still have this necessity to include sea peoples of some sort within a mythos. I think every single maritime culture, regardless of where it is, on the planet has some version of a mermaid. Might not necessarily be like half woman, half fish, but you have like the Selkies. They shed the seal skin when they come on land, and if a mortal man picks up the seal skin, then she is now enslaved to him until he gives back her skin. I know, it's a common rhetoric, right? Yeah, and I find it also fascinating that, again, dealing with these functions of folklore and having this sense of control, if a salty sailor, if they come back and they have survived this horrendous ordeal or an embellishment of a horrendous ordeal, it's going to prove that they are so much more worthy of being at sea and having this lifestyle than someone who's considered a green hand, somebody who's fresh, somebody who's never done this before. And I think mermaids play a crucial role in that. I mean, we see it within, Odysseus with the sirens, that sort of a version with the birds and the singing and all of that. But the Caribbean has mermaids, Chinese maritime cultures have mermaids, the North Sea has mermaids, the Fiji mermaid.
Is Poseidon the father of any merfolk?
I don't know about Poseidon specifically, but I know that Ea, the Mesopotamian god, he is known, or Enki, or Ea, Sumerian, Mesopotamian culture, they fathered what were to become the mermaids.
Okay, because I know in some artistic representations, Poseidon is depicted as a merman himself.
Right. And some, he's very much human.
He's a man, baby.
Human appendages. Right?
He does, but also sometimes his horses are shown as like land horses, and
Or
sometimes they're shown. And by seahorse, we don't mean real seahorses. We mean like mer horses, basically. The ancient Greek called them hippocampus, which was like a horse mer centaur type hybrid with the top of a horse and the tail of a fish.
Right, exactly. And I also think it's really fascinating because I had students one semester, they were like, why'd they choose that half and that half? And I'm like, do you really want a fish head and a human bottom half? Like, what is it, in Hotel Transylvania 3, I think, is where they have like those mer people where they're just like big goofy feet on fish bodies. And I'm like, well, what purpose would that serve if you see that in the water? Like, are you going to tell people that you've gone to sea and you saw a mermaid and you're like, oh yeah, it's just a giant fish with human feet? Like,
and then also, how would it swim? Like, you need that tail.
The propulsion, right?
Yeah,
exactly. And
you need that.
If you have this beautiful seductress who is about to kill you look like a woman on her top half, that's way more entertaining than a fish going like blah 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 blah, like,
right. And then they could speak and communicate, right? If it's their top half. And then of course we very famously have this image of the mermaid from the ancient world who has two tails instead of just the one tail. And that, take a look at the Starbucks logo, that's why she has two fins coming up. But like, that enables copulation in a human way if a mermaid has two tails. I'm just going to leave it at that because we can't get all that today.
Yeah, I mean, and even talking about the juxtaposition of why they're called mermaids, and we rarely call them merpeople or mermen. I mean, we do nowadays.
Merman!
Mermando? What?
I'm a merman, Pop. Merman.
Also, I think it provides some sort of an entertaining outlet as well. If you tell stories of sea people, specifically mermaids, of, one, she's trying to kill me, right? But then also you have a bunch of men who absolutely never, sarcastic font, practice homosexuality on board of a vessel, have all this pent up
horniness.
Yeah, there we go. And okay, and then we're talking about the things that could potentially kill them. If you have any sort of disease, if you have mental health issues, if you are constantly fearing for your life on a daily basis, you have to have some sort of escapism, some sort of element to allow yourself to fantasize about certain things. And I'm sure all of that combined with cabin fever, right? If you see a manatee or something swimming by and you're like, oh, looks like a woman. Buddy,
yeah, kind of like this same idea of like people lost in the desert and these mirages that appear in front of them, right? Like the old Looney Tunes standby of crawling through the desert, being dehydrated, and then there's an oasis in front of you, right?
Or like the one on the
horny
desert.
sailors sailing through the sea, and there's a mermaid that appears on a rock. Like, perfect solution.
Exactly. And once she tried to kill me because all women are horrible.
Obviously.
Because I'm pretty sure the fish didn't want to fuck ya, right? Like, or you have, people that really miss families. They really miss their loved ones. And the only people that were allowed to have women on board were the officers, predominantly the captain. And so I understand why so many sea monsters, cryptids, so much of the mythologies still even happens today. Like, I know that they have certain kinds of ceremonies, like when you cross the equator, that you still have to appease Poseidon or King Neptune, and you have somebody within the play dress up as that individual, and then now you're considered, one of us, part of the crew situation. There's a whole ceremony where somebody has to be Poseidon.
Ooh, I love that.
It's pretty cool. And usually it's some sort of either an invited official or someone who has some importance. So at our Maritime Academy, they always have somebody who's high up somewhere at A&M partake every sea term over the summer, where if they cross the equator, they do the ceremony and have somebody be Poseidon, and then they have to.
That is so fun.
It's so performative, and
and a holdover from a time that kind of on land been lost a little bit, but this is like a continuously operating folklore that's happening on the ocean. That's so cool. We are very excited to announce that our podcast is now up on YouTube. If that is something that you're interested in, just note it's not the full video version of our podcast. It is still the audio version, but you can access it through the YouTube platform. And we are really passionate around here about being able to speak our truths and not being beholden to conform our research interests or anything like that to any sort of corporate overlords. So while we would love to make money from this podcast, I'd say ethically, we're both pretty opposed to putting advertisements on here and being beholden to any sort of advertisement revenue. So a way around that is to support us through Patreon. You can support at multiple levels, whether it's $1 a month, $5 a month. Maybe you want to buy us a cup of coffee and get some access to some extra resources as a thank you for supporting us. You could find the Patreon link in our show notes. And we really appreciate your support. And as a small podcast, the best support you could give us is recommending us to your friends and family. So follow our social medias, send our Spotify link to people you know who might enjoy us, and help us spread the word.
You're so cute.
You're so cute. Oh, all right, cutie patootie. Okay, I love you.
Okay, I love you.
I love you more than Poseidon.
I definitely love you more than Poseidon. No contest.
Uh-oh, I hope we haven't enraged the wrath of the gods, because I do live by the sea. Uh-oh. All right. Okay, bye.
Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Oliate and Caitlin Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlin Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening.
If the wind on the sea,
in my sail,
the wind in my
sails on the sea
stays behind